The garage smelled of burnt oil and sweat, the air thick with frustration. Every tool clanged like an accusation, echoing the growing panic of the team. The CEO's private jet would land in less than an hour, and this luxury sports car, a multi-million-dollar prototype meant to launch their next big campaign, sat lifeless under the bright lights. Mechanics shouted over one another, their confidence fading with every failed attempt. In the corner, Frank Doyle quietly mopped the concrete floor. His uniform was old, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, his face lined from years of labor. No one paid him attention. To them, he was just the janitor. Invisible, unimportant, replaceable. Frank had worked in garages his whole life, though not always as a janitor. There was a time when his name was on patents, when engineers asked for his input, when his instincts were valued. But that was decades ago. The industry evolved. Machines grew more complex, and Frank's kind of wisdom, the kind learned through feel, smell, and sound, was forgotten. Still, he stayed close to the world he loved, sweeping its floors, listening to the hums and rattles that others ignored. As the head engineer slammed his wrench onto the floor, the noise made Frank flinch. He could tell from the rhythm of their frustration that they were running in circles. The clicking noise he'd heard from the engine moments earlier told him exactly where the problem was. A simple misalignment in the ignition control. But he said nothing, watching the team scramble. Then one of them muttered, "This car's cursed," and something inside Frank stirred. He took a slow breath, set his mop aside, and said softly, "Mind if I take a look?" The room erupted in laughter. The mechanics exchanged smirks. One younger technician rolled his eyes. "What's next, the janitor giving lectures?" Someone sneered. Frank didn't flinch. He walked closer, wiping his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Sometimes engines talk," he said gently. "You just have to listen." The lead engineer scoffed but stepped aside, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of exhaustion. "Go ahead, old man. Let's see your magic." Frank leaned over the car. He didn't rush. His fingers traced the edge of the metal, his ear tilted toward the engine as if hearing a song no one else could. He turned a single bolt, tightened a loose wire, and adjusted a sensor buried deep beneath the intake manifold. The younger engineers whispered, mocking him quietly, until Frank stood back and said, "Try it now." The lead engineer sighed, pressing the ignition. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then a thunderous roar filled the workshop. The engine came alive, smooth and powerful, its deep vibration rolling across the floor. Tools froze midair, jaws dropped, and every mocking face turned into stunned disbelief. The head engineer blinked at the dashboard readings. "It's perfect," he whispered. The engine's idle was steady, the power distribution flawless. It wasn't luck, it was mastery. Frank wiped his hands and smiled faintly. "Guess it just needed someone who remembers how engines used to feel," he said, voice calm, humble, sincere. The CEO, Margaret Reed, arrived just minutes later. She stepped into the silent garage, her heels echoing on the floor. "Is the prototype ready?" she asked sharply. The lead engineer stammered, "Yes, ma'am." "It's running perfectly." She looked around. Who fixed it? The room fell quiet until someone pointed toward Frank. Margaret frowned. You're the janitor." "Yes, ma'am," Frank said simply, standing straight. "Just gave it a little attention." Margaret approached the car, her sharp eyes studying the steady hum of the engine. After a long moment, she turned back to Frank. "How?" He smiled. "Machines are like people, ma'am. You push them too hard, they stop listening. You treat them right, they talk back." The CEO's expression softened. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Frank shrugged. "Just fixed what was broken. But everyone in that room knew. He had done more than that. He had fixed not just an engine, but their pride." After the demonstration, Margaret called Frank into her office. The team watched him go, some embarrassed, some inspired. When he entered, she closed the door behind them. "You worked here before, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Frank nodded. "Long time ago, before everything went digital." She smiled faintly. "Well, Mr. Doyle, consider this your rehire, but not as janitor." He frowned slightly. "Then what?" "A senior technical advisor," she said. I need people who understand not just machines, but what makes them come alive. For the first time in years, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He shook her hand, his eyes misty. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "I won't let you down." "I know," she replied. "You already didn't." By evening, word spread across the company. The janitor who everyone laughed at had saved their most valuable project. But more than that, he had reminded them that skill doesn't fade with time, and respect should never depend on titles. That night, as Frank walked home beneath the city lights, his reflection in a shop window smiled back at him, proud, humble and finally seen. In a world full of noise, it took a man who listened to bring everything back to life. The sound of metal and frustration filled the Detroit auto garage that afternoon. Wrenches clattered, voices shouted, and an expensive prototype sat lifeless in the middle of the floor. The CEO of the company was due to arrive soon for a performance test, and the entire engineering team was desperate. No one noticed Frank Doyle, the quiet janitor sweeping near the back wall. His steps were slow, his broom older than most of the tools in the shop, yet his eyes, calm and observant, never missed a thing. Frank had been working there for 7 years, cleaning floors and collecting trash after long shifts. Most people barely spoke to him, and when they did, it was usually to tell him to move out of the way. What no one knew was that before life had turned hard, Frank had once been one of the best engine tuners in the city. But layoffs, family struggles, and a cruel twist of fate had taken that away. Now, his gift hid behind a janitor's uniform and a quiet smile. That day, as he swept past the stalled car, Frank heard the uneven rhythm of the ignition trying to start and failing. He paused, listening closely, tilting his head like a doctor hearing a patient's faint heartbeat. He knew that sound. It wasn't a major failure. It was a small misalignment, something no scanner or digital readout would catch. But when he spoke up, saying softly, "Mind if I take a look?" the room broke into laughter. "Frank, this is a $1 million engine," one of the mechanics said, smirking. "You'd better stick to your mop." The others chuckled, shaking their heads, as if a janitor's hands could never touch something so advanced. But Frank didn't argue. He waited until the noise died down, then calmly set his broom aside and approached the hood. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "it's not about money. It's about feel." He reached for a small wrench, not even one of the team's fancy tools, just his own old one, polished from years of use. The lead engineer rolled his eyes but moved aside. Half amused, half curious, Frank leaned in, adjusted a single loose connection on the fuel line, then tightened a bolt near the ignition coil. His movements were precise, confident, almost graceful, the kind of expertise that can't be learned from manuals. Then, without a word, he stepped back. "Try it now," he said. The technician hesitated, but the silence that followed demanded action. The key turned. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful, filling the garage with its deep mechanical heartbeat. Every head turned toward Frank. For a moment, no one spoke. The same men who had mocked him now stared in disbelief. Frank just smiled faintly, wiping his hands on his rag. "Guess it just needed someone who remembers how engines used to feel," he said, his voice steady. In that instant, the noise of laughter was replaced by quiet respect. By the time the CEO, Amanda Hayes, arrived, word had already spread like wildfire. She stepped into a garage that stood completely still, mechanics frozen, tools forgotten, and one janitor standing beside the humming car. "Who fixed it?" she asked sharply. No one answered. Finally, someone pointed. "He did." Amanda turned, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached Frank. "You're the janitor, aren't you?" she asked in disbelief. "Yes, ma'am," he replied simply, eyes kind and humble. "Just did a little tuning." Amanda examined the engine herself, listening to its steady rhythm. "You saved us from embarrassment," she said. "This car is supposed to go public in 2 hours. Without you, we would have failed." The lead engineer, red-faced and ashamed, finally stepped forward. "We should have listened to him sooner," he admitted. Frank only nodded, already reaching for his broom again. He never wanted applause, just peace of mind that he'd done the right thing. As Frank turned to leave, Amanda stopped him. "How would you like to manage this floor instead of mopping it?" The room fell silent once again, but this time not from shock, from admiration. The same people who had laughed at him moments ago now looked at him with respect. Frank hesitated, then smiled. "Ma'am, I'll keep the floors clean." And the engines running. The garage erupted in applause. It wasn't just for the man who fixed an engine. It was for the man who reminded them what humility and mastery truly looked like. In the following weeks, Frank's life began to change. His small locker was replaced by an office, and his name appeared on the staff board, not as custodian, but as shop floor manager. Yet Frank never changed his habits. He still arrived early, still greeted everyone by name, and still swept the floor at the end of every shift. "Old habits keep me grounded," he'd say, whenever someone offered to do it for him. And soon, the younger mechanics began to seek his advice, not just on engines, but on life. Under Frank's guidance, the garage became one of the best-performing divisions in Detroit. He taught his team to listen, not just to machines, but to each other. "Engines talk," he'd say. "So do people. You just have to care enough to hear them." Slowly, the arrogance that had once filled the workshop gave way to pride, teamwork, and respect. Amanda visited often, always impressed. "You turned this place around," she told him one afternoon. Frank smiled. "No, ma'am. They just needed someone to believe in them, like you did for me." Months later, the company held a grand event to unveil their new car model. Cameras flashed, executives made speeches, and Frank stood quietly in the back, his uniform still neatly pressed. When his name was announced, the crowd erupted in applause. Amanda called him to the stage. "This man taught us something no machine ever could," she said. "That skill without heart is nothing." Frank accepted the award with a quiet nod. "I just fixed an engine," he said softly. "But along the way, it fixed me too." After the event, Frank returned to his workshop. The night was calm, the hum of engines echoing like old friends whispering. He looked around at the young mechanics laughing, the polished cars gleaming, the same floor he once mopped, and felt something deeper than pride. He had found his place again, not through ambition, but through honesty, patience, and love for his craft. The janitor, who once went unnoticed, had become a teacher, a mentor, and a living reminder that greatness often starts in silence. And so, every evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Frank would lock up the garage, broom in one hand, wrench in the other. He'd pause by the cars, running his fingers along the cool metal, listening to their quiet echoes. Somewhere between the grease and the glow of the machines, he'd smile. Because in fixing engines, he'd rebuilt something far more powerful: faith. Not just in machines, but in people and in himself.